Welcome, everyone. I know you use these videos to fall asleep. So, before that, like and subscribe to the channel. And also, what time is it? And where you watching? Tell us in the comment. Now put your headset on and relax. Ethan Carter had never been one for superstitions. A logical man, he prided himself on his ability to see the world through a lens of reason and practicality. When he moved into his new apartment, a sleek, modern high-rise overlooking the city, he saw it as a chance to reset, to leave behind the noise of his old life. The space was minimalist, almost sterile, but there was one thing he hadn't accounted for: the mirror. It stood tall against the bedroom wall, an antique thing with an ornate black frame, its glass surface unnervingly perfect. The landlord had mentioned it belonged to the previous tenant, but Ethan hadn't given it much thought. At first, it was just another object in the apartment, a practical necessity rather than something to be scrutinized. But then he noticed it. It happened one morning after a night of restless sleep. As he stood in front of the mirror, rubbing the exhaustion from his eyes, something felt off. He lifted his hand to smooth down his hair and caught it. His reflection moved just a second too late. He blinked, shook his head. The lag was subtle, almost imperceptible. Maybe he was just imagining it. He waved his hand again, testing, but everything seemed fine. Just morning grogginess, nothing more. Over the next few days, the feeling of unease grew. The lag became more noticeable. At first, it was just a fraction of a second, but then it stretched. His reflection would turn its head slightly after him, or, worse, before him. One evening, after a long day at work, he decided to test it properly. Standing in front of the mirror, he moved suddenly, raising a hand, jumping, even blinking rapidly. His reflection followed, but with deliberate hesitations. And then, just once, for the briefest moment, it didn't follow at all. Ethan's stomach knotted. His breath came short. But before he could fully process what he had seen, the reflection was normal again, mirroring him as expected. He exhaled sharply. Maybe he was overtired. Maybe stress was playing tricks on him. Then the tapping began. It started late at night, just as he was drifting to sleep. A faint, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. He groggily assumed it was something outside. A loose pipe, maybe. But as the nights passed, the sound became more distinct. It was coming from the mirror. One night, unable to take it anymore, he got up and walked over to the glass. His own face stared back at him, but something in the eyes felt wrong. He hesitated, then pressed a hand to the mirror. The tapping stopped. He waited. Nothing. Shaking his head, he muttered under his breath and turned to go back to bed. But before he could reach the covers, there was a sharp knock behind him. He spun around. His reflection was still facing the mirror. Ethan covered the mirror the next morning. He draped a sheet over it, determined to ignore whatever was happening. Out of sight, out of mind. But the tapping continued. It was softer now, but somehow more insistent, like whatever was inside the mirror was growing impatient. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Days passed, and Ethan did his best to ignore it. He spent more time outside, stayed at work later, did everything he could to avoid being alone in that apartment. But avoidance wasn't enough. One evening, after convincing himself it was all in his head, he pulled the sheet off the mirror. He told himself it was ridiculous, that he was a grown man letting a piece of glass get under his skin. But the moment the mirror was uncovered, his stomach dropped. His reflection stood with its back to him. Cold panic washed over him. He reached out a trembling hand, watching his fingers hover over the glass. His reflection didn't move. It was only when he forced himself to blink that the reflection suddenly snapped back into place, mirroring him as it should. He stumbled backward, heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't possible. He needed proof. Grabbing his phone, he set it up on a tripod and hit record. He stood before the mirror, moving deliberately, raising his arms, shifting side to side, blinking at odd intervals. Everything looked normal. Then he played back the footage. His reflection was staring at him the entire time. His real self had been moving, testing, blinking, but on the recording, the reflection never blinked once. Ethan's hands shook as he set the phone down. His reflection watched him with an intensity he couldn't explain. Then it smiled. He hadn't smiled. His breath hitched. His pulse roared in his ears. He staggered backward, grabbing his phone and shutting off the recording. That night, he avoided the mirror entirely. He turned his phone face down, covered reflective surfaces, and kept all the lights on. But he still felt watched. And then, in the dead of night, he heard it. Footsteps, not from the hallway, from inside his apartment. His blood ran cold. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the lamp and switched it on. The room was empty, but the mirror was uncovered, and his reflection was not in it. Panic overtook him. He grabbed the heaviest object he could find, a metal chair, and swung it at the mirror. Glass exploded outward, raining across the floor in sharp, glittering shards. But it didn't help. His reflection was still there, not in the broken glass, but in the window, in the dark surface of the television, in his phone screen. No matter where he turned, it was waiting. Ethan tore through the apartment, covering every reflective surface he could find. He taped towels over the bathroom mirror, shut his laptop, threw a blanket over the television. But the reflection found other ways to manifest. A fogged-up message on the bathroom mirror, "Let me out." A photo in his phone gallery, a picture of him sleeping taken from the foot of his bed. He barely slept. He barely ate. He was unraveling piece by piece. And then, one night, he woke up to find it standing at the foot of his bed. It wasn't trapped anymore. Ethan's scream tore through the apartment, but the reflection only smiled. It had waited long enough. The next morning, Ethan was gone. But in the mirror, a different Ethan remained, banging against the glass, screaming, trapped inside. Days later, a new tenant moved in. He barely noticed the antique mirror against the wall, just another furnishing left behind. And in the glass, Ethan's reflection grinned. Story 2. Ethan Carter had never been one for superstitions. A logical man, he prided himself on his ability to see the world through a lens of reason and practicality. When he moved into his new apartment, a sleek, modern high-rise overlooking the city, he saw it as a chance to reset, to leave behind the noise of his old life. The space was minimalist, almost sterile, but there was one thing he hadn't accounted for: the mirror. It stood tall against the bedroom wall, an antique thing with an ornate black frame, its glass surface unervingly perfect. The landlord had mentioned it belonged to the previous tenant, but Ethan hadn't given it much thought. At first, it was just another object in the apartment, a practical necessity rather than something to be scrutinized. But then he noticed it. It happened one morning after a night of restless sleep. As he stood in front of the mirror, rubbing the exhaustion from his eyes, something felt off. He lifted his hand to smooth down his hair and caught it. His reflection moved just a second too late. He blinked, shook his head. The lag was subtle, almost imperceptible. Maybe he was just imagining it. He waved his hand again, testing, but everything seemed fine. Just morning grogginess, nothing more. Over the next few days, the feeling of unease grew. The lag became more noticeable. At first, it was just a fraction of a second, but then it stretched. His reflection would turn its head slightly after him, or worse, before him. One evening, after a long day at work, he decided to test it properly. Standing in front of the mirror, he moved suddenly, raising a hand, jumping, even blinking rapidly. His reflection followed, but with deliberate hesitations. And then, just once, for the briefest moment, it didn't follow at all. Ethan's stomach knotted. His breath came short. But before he could fully process what he had seen, the reflection was normal again, mirroring him as expected. He exhaled sharply. Maybe he was overtired. Maybe stress was playing tricks on him. Then the tapping began. It started late at night, just as he was drifting to sleep. A faint, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. He groggily assumed it was something outside, a loose pipe maybe. But as the nights passed, the sound became more distinct. It was coming from the mirror. One night, unable to take it anymore, he got up and walked over to the glass. His own face stared back at him, but something in the eyes felt wrong. He hesitated, then pressed a hand to the mirror. The tapping stopped. He waited. Nothing. Shaking his head, he muttered under his breath and turned to go back to bed. But before he could reach the covers, there was a sharp knock behind him. He spun around. His reflection was still facing the mirror. Ethan covered the mirror the next morning. He draped a sheet over it, determined to ignore whatever was happening. Out of sight, out of mind. But the tapping continued. It was softer now, but somehow more insistent, like whatever was inside the mirror was growing impatient. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Days passed, and Ethan did his best to ignore it. He spent more time outside, stayed at work later, did everything he could to avoid being alone in that apartment. But avoidance wasn't enough. One evening, after convincing himself it was all in his head, he pulled the sheet off the mirror. He told himself it was ridiculous, that he was a grown man letting a piece of glass get under his skin. But the moment the mirror was uncovered, his stomach dropped. His reflection stood with its back to him. Cold panic washed over him. He reached out a trembling hand, watching his fingers hover over the glass. His reflection didn't move. It was only when he forced himself to blink that the reflection suddenly snapped back into place, mirroring him as it should. He stumbled backward, heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't possible. He needed proof. Grabbing his phone, he set it up on a tripod and hit record. He stood before the mirror, moving deliberately, raising his arms, shifting side to side, blinking at odd intervals. Everything looked normal. Then he played back the footage. His reflection was staring at him the entire time. His real self had been moving, testing, blinking, but on the recording, the reflection never blinked once. Ethan's hands shook as he set the phone down. His reflection watched him with an intensity he couldn't explain. Then it smiled. He hadn't smiled. His breath hitched. His pulse roared in his ears. He staggered backward, grabbing his phone and shutting off the recording. That night, he avoided the mirror entirely. He turned his phone face down, covered reflective surfaces, and kept all the lights on. But he still felt watched. And then, in the dead of night, he heard it. Footsteps. Not from the hallway. From inside his apartment. His blood ran cold. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the lamp and switched it on. The room was empty, but the mirror was uncovered, and his reflection was not in it. Panic overtook him. He grabbed the heaviest object he could find, a metal chair, and swung it at the mirror. Glass exploded outward, raining across the floor in sharp, glittering shards. But it didn't help. His reflection was still there. Not in the broken glass, but in the window, in the dark surface of the television, in his phone screen. No matter where he turned, it was waiting. Ethan tore through the apartment, covering every reflective surface he could find. He taped towels over the bathroom mirror, shut his laptop, threw a blanket over the television. But the reflection found other ways to manifest. A fogged-up message on the bathroom mirror, "Let me out." A photo in his phone gallery, a picture of him sleeping, taken from the foot of his bed. He barely slept. He barely ate. He was unraveling piece by piece. And then, one night, he woke up to find it standing at the foot of his bed. It wasn't trapped anymore. Ethan's scream tore through the apartment, but the reflection only smiled. It had waited long enough. The next morning, Ethan was gone. But in the mirror, a different Ethan remained, banging against the glass, screaming, trapped inside. Days later, a new tenant moved in. He barely noticed the antique mirror against the wall, just another furnishing left behind. And in the glass, Ethan's reflection grinned. Story 4. When I first arrived in the United States, I was full of excitement. Becoming an au pair was my chance to experience life abroad, improve my English, and explore a new culture while doing something I loved, taking care of children. The Holloway family seemed like the perfect fit. They lived in a beautiful, quiet suburb just outside of Boston, and from our video calls, they appeared polite and welcoming. Mr. and Mrs. Holloway both worked demanding jobs, which is why they needed help with their 9-year-old son, Ethan. "He's a little shy," Mrs. Holloway had said, her tone warm but guarded. "It takes him a while to warm up to new people." That didn't worry me. I had worked with children before, some shy, some difficult, but I had always managed to build a connection. When I arrived at their home, it was even grander than I had imagined. A tall, colonial-style house with massive windows, an immaculately kept lawn, and a long driveway leading up to a dark wooden door. Inside, the decor was elegant but cold. The walls were decorated with expensive artwork, but there were no family photos, no signs of a child's presence, no drawings on the fridge, no toys scattered around. Felt more like a museum than a home. Mrs. Holloway greeted me with a polite smile and led me through the house, showing me my room, the kitchen, and the living spaces. Finally, we stopped outside a door at the end of the hallway. Then, as if I weren't there, he turned and walked back into his room. Mrs. Holloway let out a small sigh. Like I said, he's shy. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that child. I had met quiet children before, even ones with behavioral issues, but Ethan was different. There was something in the way he moved, in the way he watched me, that made my skin crawl. As I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I heard it, a soft creaking sound, like someone standing just outside my door. My breath caught in my throat. I listened, straining to hear. A minute passed, then two. Finally, I forced myself out of bed, tiptoeing toward the door. With a deep breath, I pulled it open. The hallway was empty. I exhaled shakily. Maybe I was imagining things. But as I turned back toward my bed, my heart stopped. At the far end of the hallway, just barely visible in the dim light, Ethan was standing there, watching me. My voice caught in my throat. "Ethan, what are you doing?" He didn't answer. His lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, and then he turned and walked away. The next morning, I woke up to a loud thump against my window. Still groggy, I stumbled over and pulled back the curtain. My stomach twisted. A dead bird lay on the windowsill, its neck bent at an unnatural angle. Blood had splattered across the glass. My breath came in short gasps as I noticed something else. A small, smudged handprint pressed against the window pane. A child's handprint. I swallowed hard. I already knew the answer, but I turned away from the window and forced myself to ask the question anyway. Had Ethan done this? I tried to tell Mr. and Mrs. Holloway that something wasn't right, that their son was different. Mrs. Holloway pursed her lips, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "He's always been unique," she admitted. "He doesn't form attachments the way other children do." I hesitated before asking, "Has he ever hurt anyone?" Her face froze for just a moment, but it was enough. When she spoke again, her voice was controlled, careful. "You don't need to worry about Ethan." But I did. That night, for the first time, I locked my bedroom door. The following nights were worse. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find my door slightly open, even though I knew I had locked it. I started keeping a chair pushed against it, but every morning it would be slightly moved. I heard whispers in the dark, but when I turned on the light, there was nothing there. Then, one night, I woke up gasping, my heart hammering. I had felt something brush against my face, something light, like fingertips. I bolted upright and turned on the lamp. My blood ran cold. There on my pillow was a knife. A long, sharp kitchen knife. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached out with trembling hands, barely able to comprehend what I was seeing. And then I heard it breathing. I turned slowly. In the shadows of my room, barely visible in the dim glow of my bedside lamp, Ethan stood watching me, smiling. My entire body went rigid. "Ethan, I barely recognized my own voice. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there, grinning. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he turned and walked out of my room. The door clicked shut behind him. That was it. I had to leave. I didn't care about my contract, about the money. Nothing mattered except getting out of that house. That night, I packed my bags, waiting until I was sure Mr. and Mrs. Holloway were asleep. I tiptoed down the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. I never found out what happened to Ethan. Story 4. James Miller, 29, unshaven and exhausted-looking, groggily sat up in his dimly lit studio apartment as a soft alarm chimed. He rubbed his eyes, running a hand through his disheveled hair before stumbling into the bathroom. Flicking on the light, the fluorescent bulbs hummed overhead. He leaned over the sink, staring at his reflection, just himself. Tired. Lifeless. With a sigh, he grabbed his toothbrush and began brushing his teeth. Then something odd happened. His reflection hesitated for a split second before following his motion. A barely noticeable lag. James paused, toothpaste foam dripping from his lip. He stared at the mirror, waiting for another anomaly. But there was nothing. Just his own tired face staring back at him. He shook his head. Probably just his imagination. He finished brushing, splashed water on his face, and exited the bathroom, pushing the moment from his mind. Later that night, James sat at his laptop, typing away. The glow of the screen cast deep shadows across his already weary features. He glanced toward the mirror near his closet just for a second, but froze. His reflection was already looking at him. A cold chill crept down his spine. Slowly, he turned his head toward the mirror, heart pounding. His reflection matched him perfectly now. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. He was just tired. That was all. Brushing it off, he got up, turned off the light, and climbed into bed. The faint glow from the streetlight outside seeped through his curtains, illuminating the mirror just enough to make out his own silhouette. As he closed his eyes, his reflection remained barely visible, watching. The next morning, James moved with a sense of unease. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror again, he brushed his teeth, but this time he watched the reflection intently. He raised his right hand. The reflection followed. He tilted his head. The reflection copied him perfectly. Then, just to test it, James made a sudden, random movement. For a brief second, his reflection lagged behind. His breath caught in his throat. He leaned in closer, scanning the mirror for any other inconsistencies. Then, without warning, the reflection suddenly smiled. James stumbled backward, knocking over the towel rack. He gasped, his heart slamming against his ribs. His eyes darted back to the mirror, but now his reflection was normal. It mimicked his every move again, as if nothing had ever been wrong. He stood there, frozen in place, before shaking his head and rushing out of the bathroom. That night, anxiety gnawed at him. Sitting at his kitchen table, James scrolled through his phone, desperately searching for answers. Delayed reflections, psychological disorder? Can mirrors glitch? He found nothing that made sense. He rubbed his temples, exhausted, when something in his phone screen's reflection caught his eye. The mirror near his closet. His reflection was turned slightly toward him, watching. Smiling. James's breath hitched as he spun around, heart hammering in his chest. But the mirror showed nothing unusual. His reflection copied him perfectly. He swallowed hard, body trembling as he grabbed a sheet and threw it over the mirror, covering it completely. Sleep did not come easy. Somewhere deep in the night, James woke up gasping for air, his body drenched in cold sweat. A nightmare? His eyes darted toward the closet. The sheet was on the floor. The mirror was uncovered. His reflection was there, watching, smiling. James bolted upright, his breath ragged. He scrambled out of bed, grabbed the sheet again, and frantically taped it down around the edges. He stepped back, staring at the covered mirror. It would stay this way. He would make sure of it. He collapsed onto his bed, exhausted beyond reason. Then, in the silence, he heard it. A soft tape peeling sound. His eyes widened. The sheet slid off the mirror on its own. James didn't wait. He sprinted out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The next day, James sat across from his friend Lucas at a cafe, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, fingers twitching slightly. "I know how it sounds," he whispered, voice trembling. "But my reflection, it's not me." Lucas exhaled, rubbing his temples as if he were dealing with a child. "Dude, you've been stressed. You need sleep." "No, listen," James insisted, leaning in, his voice almost desperate. "It hesitates. Sometimes it doesn't move at all. And last night, it smiled." Lucas laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Mirrors don't smile, James." James's eyes burned into his friend. "But I wasn't smiling." Lucas faltered for just a second before masking his concern with a casual shrug. "Take a break, man. No more horror movies at night." James just stared at him. No use. Lucas wouldn't believe him. No one would. That night, James covered every mirror in his apartment. The bathroom, the closet, even his laptop screen. He taped them down, making sure they stayed covered. Then, a sound. Knocking. From inside the bathroom. James froze. His blood ran ice cold. The knocking continued. Soft. Slow. Deliberate. He inched toward the bathroom door, heart in his throat. Slowly, carefully, he pushed the door open. The bathroom mirror was bare. The tape and covers were gone. His reflection was missing. James stumbled back, a cold sweat breaking out over his skin. Then a footstep behind him. He spun around. Nothing. He slowly turned back to the mirror. His reflection was back. But it wasn't copying him. It tilted its head, smiling. A whisper slithered from the glass, "Let me in." James screamed. He avoided mirrors after that. But it didn't matter. Reflections still appeared. In windows. In puddles. In his phone screen. Every time his reflection was there. Smiling. Watching. He couldn't take it anymore. James grabbed a hammer. One by one, he smashed every mirror in his apartment. Glass shattered. Pieces fell. His breath heaved as he stood among the wreckage. But then, in the shards of broken glass, his reflection was still there. Still moving. Still grinning. Then the lights flickered. James turned. The bathroom mirror. The only one left. His reflection was already looking at him. Waiting. James approached, hands shaking. The reflection slowly raised a hand. James, mesmerized, reached out. Their fingers touched the glass. Then the reflection grabbed him. James screamed as his body jerked forward. The lights flickered violently. Then silence. The mirror stood still. James stood before it. But something was different. His expression. Neutral. Cold. Inside the mirror, the real James screamed, pounding against the glass. The new James smirked. He turned and walked away. Inside the mirror, James continued to pound, his silent screams lost in the void. The lights dimmed. The apartment grew quiet. Outside, the world moved on, unaware. Fade to black.
"The house is alive." Daniel dropped the journal, his breath shallow and uneven, his own handwriting, his own words, but he had no memory of writing them. His pulse thundered in his ears. How long had he been here? His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, searching for an answer. The entries became more erratic, more desperate. Some words were scratched out violently. Others were smudged as if written in haste, or perhaps with shaking hands. Then, near the back of the book, he found something that made his blood run cold. "I set the house on fire." Daniel's eyes widened. The words were scrawled in thick, uneven strokes, as if the writer had been frantic. "I burned it down. I watched the flames eat through the walls. I felt the heat. I heard it collapse. And yet, I woke up back inside. The house doesn't die. It doesn't let you die either. It only resets." Daniel's hands went numb, the journal slipping from his fingers. His breathing became ragged. He stumbled back, his mind racing. This can't be real. This has to be a nightmare. He turned toward the door again, his instincts screaming at him to run, but stopped cold. The door was gone. Where the front entrance had been, there was now only a blank wooden wall. His stomach twisted in horror. His mind reeled. His body tensed in fight or flight terror. That was when he heard it. A slow, deliberate creak from behind him. He turned and saw himself. Daniel stood frozen. The figure before him was identical to him. Same dark hair, same frightened expression, same clothes. But something was off. The other Daniel's eyes were hollow, sunken. His skin looked wrong, like it had been left out in the elements for far too long. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then he raised a shaking hand and pointed behind Daniel. A whisper slithered through the room, low and guttural. Daniel's blood turned to ice. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see. But his body betrayed him. He turned. The walls were moving. Not shifting, not changing, breathing. The wood pulsed like living flesh, expanding and contracting as if the house itself was alive. The whispering grew louder, layered voices overlapping in a nightmarish chorus. Daniel's chest tightened. The air was thick, suffocating. His reflection, his doppelganger, was still watching him, mouth moving in silent urgency. And then suddenly he heard it. The voice. His voice. Run. Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted. The house was shifting around him as he ran, doors appearing and disappearing, the hallway stretching endlessly one moment and then collapsing in on itself the next. The walls bulged and twisted as if something inside them was moving. Something huge, something hungry. He reached a window and slammed his fists against the glass. It wouldn't break. He grabbed a chair, hurled it with all his strength. Nothing. Panic surged through him. His reflection in the window moved out of sync, a fraction of a second slower than him. It wasn't just a reflection, it was watching him. A sound behind him. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Coming closer. Daniel turned, his body locked in terror. A figure stood at the end of the hall. Not his doppelganger. Something else. Something that looked like a man but wasn't. Its body was stretched, elongated. Its limbs too thin, its head slightly tilted as if trying to understand him. Its face was blurred, shifting in and out of focus like a bad signal on an old television. And it was coming for him. Daniel ran. He sprinted down the hallway, past doors that led nowhere, past windows that showed nothing but darkness. Then suddenly, a door he recognized. The bedroom, the journal. He burst through, slamming the door behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pressed his back against the wood. The whispers grew louder. The walls trembled. Daniel turned to the journal on the nightstand. A new entry had appeared. His heart pounded as he read the words forming before his eyes. You've been here before. You'll be here again. The house remembers you. It will always remember you. Daniel grabbed the journal and did the only thing he could think of. He ripped out the pages, stuffed them into the fireplace, and grabbed the box of matches from the mantel. His hands were shaking so badly he almost couldn't strike one. Finally, a spark. The flames roared to life. The house screamed, not creaking, not whispering, screaming. The walls convulsed. The floor buckled beneath his feet. The shadows twisted and lashed like living things. The figure outside the bedroom door howled, pounding against the wood. The fire spread fast. Too fast. The cabin was burning, but so was Daniel. He could feel it, not just his skin, but something deeper, something inside him. Then darkness. Daniel woke with a start. He was sitting in a car. His car. His hands gripped the steering wheel. His duffel bag was in the passenger seat. The dirt road stretched ahead of him, winding through the dense forest. His breath came in shallow gasps. His heart hammered in his chest. Then he saw it. The cabin. Old. Wooden.
Familiar.
Waiting. Daniel's grip tightened on the wheel. He didn't remember driving here. He didn't remember anything. He reached for his phone. No signal. A small piece of paper sat on the dashboard. He picked it up with trembling fingers. A note. His own handwriting. Do not go inside. His stomach twisted. Then, as if pulled by something unseen, his hand reached for the door handle. And despite everything, despite the warning, despite the terror clawing at his chest, he stepped out. The house remembered him, and the cycle began again.
The hollow guest. Ethan Caldwell had no reason to rent out his spare bedroom. He lived alone, made decent money at his dull IT job, and wasn't the kind of guy who liked company. But the room was there, empty, and something about that felt wrong. Like it was waiting for something. On a whim, he listed it online. No pictures, no price. Just a simple ad, room available. Quiet neighborhood. No pets. Within minutes, he got a response. I'll take it. Can move in tonight. No questions. No negotiation. The name was just Jay. No profile picture. No background info. Ethan should have ignored it, but something about the speed of the reply hooked him. At exactly 9 p.m., the doorbell rang. Ethan's stomach tightened. He hadn't really thought about what kind of person would answer an ad like that. He opened the door. The man outside was wrong. Not in an obvious way. He wasn't disfigured or bleeding or monstrous. He was just forgettable. A nondescript face. No scars, no wrinkles, no emotion. Dressed in gray. A man who could be anyone or no one at all. You must be Jay, Ethan said, throat dry. Jay nodded. Didn't blink. Didn't smile. Just stepped inside without being invited. Jay had no luggage. No questions. He walked straight to the empty room, stepped inside, and shut the door. Ethan stood in the hall, heart hammering. He expected to hear something unpacking, shifting, settling in. But there was nothing. No movement. No sound. Just silence. Ethan didn't sleep well that night. Something about the lack of presence in the next room unsettled him more than if Jay had been pacing or muttering in his sleep. By morning, Jay was gone. The bedroom door was open, the bed untouched. Like he had never been there at all. But the room smelled different. Not like cologne or sweat. Just empty. Hollow. Jay never ate. Never left for work. Never existed in any normal way. Each night, Ethan heard nothing. Each morning, Jay was gone. And yet, the rent money appeared in an envelope on the counter every single day without fail. Ethan tried to talk to him. Hey man, how's the room? Jay would pause. Not blink, not breathe, just pause. Then he'd say, in a voice so flat it barely sounded human, the room is fine. No inflection. No emotion. Ethan asked more. Where do you work? I am employed. Where are you from? I am from somewhere. The answers weren't wrong, but they weren't right either. They were hollow, just like him. One night, Ethan woke up cold. Not normal cold, deep cold. The kind that crawls inside your bones. His bedroom door was open. He never left his door open. A shape stood in the doorway. Not moving. Not breathing. Just watching. Jay, Ethan's voice caught in his throat. His body refused to move. Jay didn't come closer. Didn't speak. Just stood there. And then he turned. Walked back into the spare bedroom. Shut the door. Ethan's body unlocked. He gasped. Scrambled out of bed. And ran to the hallway. Jay's door was open. The room was empty. But on the bed, carved deep into the wood, was a single word. Stay. Ethan stopped sleeping. The air in the apartment felt wrong. Like the walls were thinner. Like something was pressing against them from the outside. He left food out. It was never touched. He called the number Jay had texted from. Disconnected. He checked the online listing. Gone. Then one night he heard it. Not silence. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Coming from the spare bedroom. He crept to the door. The room was dark. But in the corner something moved. Not like a person shifting or rolling over. No, this movement was unnatural, like something unfolding. Ethan slammed the door and locked it. He couldn't stay anymore. At dawn, he packed a bag. But when he reached the front door, it wasn't there. Not just locked. Gone. The walls stretched, shifting, warping. The apartment was bigger. Longer hallways. More doors. Doors he had never seen before. And down the longest hall, the spare bedroom door stood wide open. Inside, the walls breathed. Something waited. And then Jay's voice, calm and hollow, "You invited me in." Ethan turned. Jay wasn't human anymore. His face was empty. Not blank, empty. A hole where a person should be. A void that sucked the air from the room. And then Jay stepped forward. Ethan ran. He didn't make it far. The hallway stretched, shifted, led nowhere. And then a door. His old bedroom door. He flung it open. Inside the spare room, Jay stood in the center, smiling, and behind him more figures. Dozens, hundreds, all hollow, all waiting. Jay tilted his head. The room is never empty for long. Ethan screamed, and the door slammed shut. The apartment was quiet again. The spare bedroom sat empty, waiting. A new listing appeared online. Room available. Quiet neighborhood. No pets. Within minutes, someone replied, "I'll take it. Can move in tonight." And so the room smiled, because it was never empty for long. This should make for a suspenseful, eerie, and immersive horror experience. Let me know if you want any tweaks or a different style. Ethan Carter never believed in ghosts. He considered supernatural stories nothing more than a result of an overactive imagination. But all of that changed when he inherited his late uncle's house on Blackwood Lane in rural Maine. The house was massive, a Victorian-era mansion standing alone on a hill, surrounded by dead trees that twisted into grotesque shapes under the moonlight. Thick fog clung to the ground like a living entity. There were no neighbors for miles. Ethan had been inside this house only once before, when he was a child. His uncle, Thomas Carter, was an eccentric man, obsessed with the occult. He often spoke of the shadows and how they watched him. Everyone in the family dismissed it as insanity until he was found dead. The police report stated that his body was discovered in front of a shattered mirror, his face frozen in sheer terror, eyes wide open, mouth twisted as if screaming before he died. His hands were covered in deep scratch marks, as if he had been trying to claw at something no one else could see. The locals called it the Blackwood Curse. But Ethan was a man of reason. He didn't believe in curses. He was here to sell the property and be done with it, or so he thought. Ethan arrived late in the evening. As soon as he stepped inside, a cold draft rushed past him. The air smelled old, a mixture of damp wood and something faintly metallic. Blood? Shaking off the unease, he flicked on the lights. They flickered once, then stabilized. The interior was just as he remembered. Antique furniture, dusty chandeliers, and massive paintings of long-dead ancestors staring at him with hollow eyes. As he explored the house, he found himself standing in front of a familiar mirror. It was tall, ornate, and cracked. The cracks spread like veins across the glass, distorting his reflection. For a moment, he thought he saw something move behind him. He spun around. Nothing. "Relax, Ethan," he muttered to himself. Shaking off the unease, he went upstairs to the bedroom, unaware of the shadow that watched him from the mirror. That night, Ethan was awakened by a whisper. "Help me." His eyes snapped open. The room was pitch black. He reached for the lamp, but before he could turn it on, he heard it again. "He won't let me leave." A child's voice. His breath caught in his throat. The whisper had come from the mirror. With a pounding heart, he grabbed his phone and used the flashlight. The mirror's reflection was wrong. His room was empty, but in the reflection, someone stood in the corner. A small boy, pale, emaciated. His mouth was stitched shut. His hollow eyes stared directly at Ethan. And then the boy moved. The mirror cracked further. The whisper turned into a distorted, inhuman shriek. Ethan stumbled backward. The lamp suddenly flickered on by itself, and the room was empty again. No boy, no sound. His chest rose and fell rapidly. It was just a nightmare. It had to be. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The next day, Ethan drove into town to research the house's history. What he found made his blood run cold. The house had a long history of unexplained deaths. In 1892, a family of 5 disappeared inside the house. Only the youngest son was found, muttering about a shadow in the mirror. He was sent to an asylum. In 1946, a woman who lived there slit her own throat. But according to witnesses, she was smiling before she died. In 1997, Ethan's own uncle, Thomas Carter, had been the latest victim. He had become obsessed with the mirror, claiming he saw something inside it that wanted to escape. And now, Ethan was next. That night, he set up cameras around the house. He needed proof. 3 a.m., the cameras glitched. The house grew unnaturally cold. Ethan's breath became visible. The lights flickered violently. And then the whisper returned. "He's coming." The shadows in the room moved. They stretched, twisted, and began crawling toward him. Then the mirror shattered. A black, faceless entity emerged from the shards, its hollow eyes fixed on Ethan. He tried to run, but the doors slammed shut. The air grew thick, suffocating. The boy's voice screamed in his head, "Destroy the well." That's where he came from. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heaviest object he could find, a chair, and hurled it at the mirror. It shattered completely, and the shadow let out a deafening, otherworldly screech. The house shook violently. The walls cracked. And then silence. The presence was gone. Ethan ran. He didn't stop until he was miles away from that cursed house. A week later, Ethan sold the house, but as he drove away, he made the mistake of looking in his car's rearview mirror. And there, in the reflection, the shadow was still smiling. Sarah had been single for a while when she met Daniel on a dating app. He wasn't just charming, he was perfect. Too perfect. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, as if he already knew everything about her. He mirrored her jokes, anticipated her thoughts, and always had the perfect response. It was comforting, in a way, like talking to someone who had known her forever. Maybe she had just been alone for too long. Maybe this was what real compatibility felt like. Their first date only reinforced the feeling. They met at an intimate little restaurant, and as soon as she sat down, Daniel smiled and said, "I took the liberty of ordering for you. I hope that's okay." She glanced at the plate in front of her. Pasta just the way she liked it, with the extra Parmesan. Her favorite dish, and she was almost certain she hadn't mentioned it. When she asked him how he knew, he only chuckled. Lucky guess. Throughout dinner, his responses felt rehearsed, polished. He laughed at all the right moments, responded to her stories with the exact emotions she would expect. He was attentive, but something about it felt like an act, a flawless mimicry. Still, she brushed it off. First dates could be awkward, and maybe he was just trying to impress her. She wanted to believe it was fate, not coincidence, that had brought them together. As their relationship progressed, the sense of unease never quite left her. Daniel was still the perfect boyfriend, always knowing exactly what she wanted before she even said it. But he avoided questions about his past, changing the subject whenever she pressed for details. He had no social media, no old photos, no stories about childhood mischief or high school friends. Whenever she tried to take a picture of him, he turned away. "I hate cameras," he said, but there was something in his voice, something almost afraid. One night, after they had spent the evening at her apartment, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing her teeth. Daniel was behind her, scrolling through his phone. But when she glanced at the reflection, her stomach dropped. His mirrored image was a split second behind reality. Just enough to notice. Just enough to make her heart pound in her chest. She spun around, but Daniel only smiled at her, oblivious. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she muttered, forcing a laugh. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she had imagined it. But as the days passed, the feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't just the mirror. It was the way he would tilt his head when she looked at him, as if studying her. The way his expressions always seemed to match hers a little too perfectly. And then there was the night she saw his reflection staring at her from the window while he was looking down at his hands. She started digging. She searched for his name online, but there was nothing. No past addresses, no family connections, no school records. It was like he had appeared out of nowhere. When she called the restaurant where they had their first date, hoping to find a receipt or record of their reservation, the hostess hesitated. "I'm sorry, miss. We don't have any record of that name." Her heart pounded. That wasn't possible. She had been there. She had eaten the food. She had felt the warmth of his hand on hers. But when she checked her phone for their old texts, some were missing. Gaps in conversations that she knew had existed. She tried calling his number, and though she could hear the faint buzz of his phone vibrating in the other room, the call never registered on his screen. Her unease turned to dread. She needed to know the truth. That night, when Daniel left her apartment, she followed him. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace, as if he knew exactly where he was going. The route he took was strange, turning down alleyways, moving through areas that seemed unfamiliar, almost abandoned. When he finally stopped in front of an old apartment building, she hesitated. But she had come this far. She had to see what was inside. The apartment was eerily silent. No personal belongings, no clutter, no lived-in mess. But there were mirrors. So many mirrors. Some were cracked, others covered with sheets. And in the center of the room, there was a drawer. Slowly, her hands trembling, she pulled it open. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Her own face stared back at her from everyone. Some were recent, others older, from years ago, pictures she had never seen before, taken at angles that made no sense. She felt sick. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't love. The door creaked open behind her. Daniel stood there, watching her. His face was calm, but something was different now. He wasn't trying to be charming anymore. His features shifted slightly, like a flickering image on a broken screen. His voice was layered when he spoke, like multiple voices speaking at once. "You weren't supposed to look." Her breath caught in her throat. "What are you?" He sighed, almost regretful. "I'm what you see in the mirror. The part of you that stares back. The part that watches. You've been looking at me your whole life, and I've been looking back, waiting for the day you let me in." His face shimmered, and in an instant, it was hers. The exact same face, the same eyes, the same mouth, now curling into a twisted smile. She ran. The door slammed behind her as she bolted down the street, heart pounding. But as she looked around, panic rising in her chest, something was wrong. The reflections in store windows didn't match reality. Streetlights cast shadows that didn't belong to anything. The world around her was subtly wrong, like a distorted version of reality. Daniel was behind her, his voice still calm. "You let me in, Sarah. There's no going back." She stumbled into an alley, her breath ragged. There was a mirror leaning against the wall, cracked but still intact. Desperate, she grabbed a brick and smashed it. The air around her seemed to fracture, the world splitting apart at the seams. And then blackness. She woke up in her bed. The sun streamed through the curtains. Her phone buzzed with a message from her best friend. The apartment looked the same as always. A nightmare. That's all it was. Just a nightmare. She exhaled, shaking, and went about her day. But the feeling didn't go away. The world felt different. When she passed by a store window, she caught a glimpse of herself and felt an odd chill. That night, as she stepped into the bathroom, she froze. Her reflection wasn't moving. Her breath hitched. Her hands trembled. And then it smiled.